This is Subjects in Process, a podcast where we explore the limits of our knowledge, try to understand the things we take for granted, and work to see things from new points of view. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Jonathan.
All right.
All right.
This is our first episode.
This is our first episode, and this is we're calling it Subjects in Process because we kind of imagine it as an ongoing dialogue about different subjects that we're going to be exploring over a series of episodes, and as well as ourselves as subjects who are learning and changing. What might be exceptional or different about this podcast is we're not here to present our own expertise. We're here to present our ignorance as we attempt to learn, as maybe hopefully many of you kind of feel the same way, that the world's a bit bigger than we can fit in our heads, and it can be a bit confusing out there. So we're just trying to be a little more intentional about our learning and see where this goes.
Totally. Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that you and I have been friends for a quarter of a century.
Oh man.
Over 25 years, I think. And we've been doing this sort of thing for fun for most of that time. And often we'll come up against sort of the limits of what we know. I'm excited about the chance to just chat with you about things that we think about anyways, and maybe, become a little bit more aware of things and understand the different facets of a lot of the issues that sometimes seem black and white. Maybe there's some more shades of gray in there.
I think that sounds great. I mean, if nothing else, it's a chance for us to just continue having more of these conversations. So for our first episode, there's just so many places we could jump in, and Jeff and I have already had some back and forths a bit on socialism and capitalism and some of these political issues, which today can feel quite heated. And I love talking with Jeff about these issues because he feels thoughtful and reflective. And so rather than just jump in with too much of our ignorance, we wanted to start talking about someone else's perspective. So today's podcast is going to be focused on getting some of Jeff's first thoughts on the book Eugene McCarraher's Enchantments of Mammon. So just to be clear and fair to Jeff, he hasn't finished the book.
No.
And but I think that's actually appropriate because we're not trying to pretend that we have a grasp on these things. And so even when we talk about this book, which Jeff has just shown me on the video as being quite a mammoth tome, we're never gonna we doubt our ability to fully understand this man's work. So when we're talking about his work, we're talking about our own understanding of it. And I haven't read it, so I'm here to learn from Jeff today and hoping to kind of get some of what he's drawn out from it so far, and see where he's at.
Yeah.
So my first question for you, Jeff, is why did you pick this book? What brought you here? So I guess the two sides of that are, why are you interested in the subject matter, and what particular credentials does this book have, say, as opposed to some other book you might have chosen?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is a really interesting book, and I've wanted to read it for probably a year and a half now. And just, I guess, so for context, I'm about 360 pages in out of 660 pages. So there's a lot left. But he does an amazing job of really signposting his argument and giving a good sense of what he's arguing, what he's thinking about. And so, this is really preliminary, and more just, I would like to be able to share about the book. I heard about it. I've read a lot of Eugene McCarraher's articles in different magazines. He's written for the Hedgehog Review and for Plough Quarterly, which is a awesome couple of journals. I think he used to write for Books and Culture as well. And I heard about the book in Plough Quarterly. There was this sort of special issue all about capitalism, and David Bentley Hart had an article in there as well, and a bunch of other people. And this was an article that was about John Ruskin, who is a Victorian writer. And I had studied him a little bit at university. But basically, McCarraher was saying John Ruskin is sort of this guy we need to recover. We need to start thinking about what he wrote, because he is presenting an idea of socialism that is different than the Marxist lineage, and that has all sorts of really neat ideas surrounding it. So I suppose, I'm not reading it because I want a good critique of capitalism. And the book doesn't really critique capitalism per se. It's more, it's implicit, I guess, in the whole thing. What it's trying to do is uh, it's trying to assert basically that, we are creatures who worship and long and have these desires. And when capitalism came on the scene at the dawn of modernity, it wasn't like all of those things just went away and science sort of solved all of our longing for mystery. Rather, there wasn't a disenchantment of the world. It was just a change in what was enchanted, and his book is really all about talking about that, showing how again and again these attempts to put capitalism to work in service of those longings actually fails to really arrive at what we are really longing for and really wanting to do. Um, so that's what the book is about. Um,
Yeah,
and
that's already super exciting. One thing that I just that you mentioned in that is this notion of worship, and that kind of suggests to me this probably comes from a religious background.
yes,
Yeah, yeah. And
yeah,
so I just want to kind of hear you kind of unpack that word a bit. I think of like the concepts of awe, which I think I've heard you talk about a bit, maybe even being in this book, and just thinking about um, what concepts of worship kind of might mean in kind of as broadly as possible.
mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's a good catch, I think. McCarraher is a associate professor at Villanova University. I think he's Catholic. He's a pretty, I'd say he's a prominent Christian left kind of personality or something
Yep,
like that. I'm not sure if
yep,
he would like that description, but
yep.
um, and so yeah, he's pretty explicit early in the book that he's writing from this perspective of there is the world is enchanted, and for him, what that means is it's filled with material signs of the divine. Um, and so to kind of back that up a bit, there was a book that came out, I think, 15 years ago or so, called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor. And it got a lot of press, a lot of interest in the academy. And what he
Canadian,
talks
right?
about, he's a Canadian. Yeah, he's from
Yeah, just
Montreal.
just just throwing it out, a little
Yep,
thumbs up to our good
yep,
local thinkers.
yep.
Local.
McGill philosopher, very important for Jack Layton. He was a kind of Jack Layton's mentor.
Okay.
Uh, so yeah, just an interesting, really interesting thinker. Also Catholic.
And
Um,
Jack Layton is
the NDP, I mean, late NDP
right.
leader.
Yeah,
I
great,
guess he
cool.
passed away several years ago now, but
Yeah,
he was a cool dude.
yeah.
Um, so, anyways, the thing that Charles Taylor talks about is he says, with the beginning of the modern period, we begin to see a turn away from sort of uh, what he calls uh, a buff. The oh no, I might be getting this mixed up. The buffered self. Um, Essentially, he says we had or no, it's the porous self. Sorry,
Yeah, no, no, that's
it
okay.
also is a 750-page book.
Yes, no, and
uh,
I think that's okay. Like it's even just maybe a point to note. We're gonna be talking about words, and we're just gonna sometimes have to make up our own definitions for things, right? And trying to avoid the focus on just exactly what word and what it
Yes.
means, and
Yes.
kind of just focusing on what's our understanding of the words we're using. So,
Yes.
if we don't get this right, it's because we're not scholars, but we're going to be doing our best and trying to just be making sense with it with whatever words we need. So
Yes, totally. So
the
Charles
porous
Taylor,
self.
the porous self, yeah. So, he sees the kind of pre-modern era as this world that's inhabited by spirits, from the kind of perspective of the average person, right? The world is full of spirits. The reason that things happen are often mystical or spiritual in nature. And what he says is, with the dawn of modernity, and this is again, this is a book I haven't read, but I kind of know the argument. Um, you begin to see the emergence of what he describes as exclusive humanism. There's been all sorts of other kinds of humanism in the past, and there continue to be, but exclusive humanism, the way that I've been thinking of it is the idea that there is no outside to the world, to the universe, right? The universe is self-enclosed, and he calls that the immanent frame. And so what he also says, though, is that doesn't mean that that's the end of kind of a transcendent sort of feeling, right? The transcendent feeling, the desire for the numinous, all of these sorts of ways of talking about. He also calls it fullness, the feeling of fullness. All of those things continue to be deeply part of the human experience, and they just look different in this, what he thinks of as a disenchanted world. Um, so I guess, to go back to your question about worship, um, he would say, I think, that worship continues to be an orientation that humans just do. We just do that, right? We uh, imbue objects, or people or whatever, with more meaning and significance, maybe an infinite amount of significance, which results in them being objects that we idolize, or that we uh, think they're going to solve all our problems, right? Our hopes and anxieties are somehow hung on the fulfillment of that they promise, whether they've said that they promise it or not. um,
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
no, that's great. That's really helpful. I mean, I think of Richard Dawkins, and just the fact that he, in his criticisms of religion, he criticizes sometimes the religious notion that they have exclusive access to worship and awe, right? And I
Yes.
mean, and he's criticizing I mean, he may be setting up a straw dog. He may be criticizing a small subset of Christianity, but the point being that he agrees that this is an orientation of humans to the world who feel it kind of regardless of their religious orientation.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So just that the notion of worship and awe kind of being kind of a very full and broad notion of what's kind of a part of human living. He's talking about capitalism implicitly, and talking about this kind of loss of this. Now, one thing I wanted to just give you a chance to talk a little more about is, you mentioned the porous self
Yeah.
and the immanent frame,
Yes.
and just if you want to make a distinction at this point about kind of the differences between our Canadian philosopher, whose name already slips my mind,
Chuck Taylor.
Charles Chuck Taylor,
Yeah.
and what this guy's presentation of this is.
Yeah. Oh, sure, sure. So he actually, McCarraher has a little section where he critiques Charles Taylor. Not in, I mean, he likes him, I think.
Yeah.
But he says that the thing that's interesting, because, and I don't know if we've quite talked about this yet, but um, the whole premise of one of McCarraher's key points is that, you know, we often think of modernity as a disenchantment of the world, right? And that's something that comes from Max Weber. And for McCarraher, he says, no, it's not disenchanted. It's misenchanted,
Mm,
but the enchantment never went away. That sort
right.
of orientation to the world. He says that's different than what Charles Taylor says, because Charles Taylor, at least for McCarraher, buys into that. He says the world is disenchanted
Mm.
in modernity,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's almost like the loss of the porous self, the arise of the buffered self, which is like a self that is enclosed, that sort of
Mm.
doesn't allow itself to be pierced by the outside.
Yeah.
Um, the thing about that is that you still see the numinous. And so McCarraher says, okay, and so Charles Taylor is really just wanting us to look for opportunities to re-enchant the world.
Mm-hmm.
And what McCarraher says is, he says that's like trying to be deliberately spontaneous. He says
Right.
it just doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
And a better approach, which is what he's saying he's doing,
Yeah.
is uh, to recognize that that the world is not disenchanted, to
Right.
kind of recognize the way that the world is actually enchanted, but in kind of what he sees as corrupt ways.
Okay. So there again, so you mentioned Max Weber and how he kind of references that line of argumentation about the disenchantment. So do you want to just kind of like, it almost sounded to me like maybe Max Weber is he's riffing off that. So do you want to just
Yeah.
kind of like spell out a little bit about what Max Weber said that he's referring to and how he uses it?
Sure. Um, so Max Weber is I guess, a sociologist from the turn of the 20th century. And he wrote a book that is pretty important called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And it's 1905. And I think, his argument is, kind of long and complicated, but he starts from this position of saying, why is it that successful capitalists tend to be Protestant? That's the beginning of the book. It's really kind of funny, but there's a really great quote that I found, and it's actually the quote where he talks about the disenchantment of the world,
Oh,
Weber.
awesome.
So he says, um, the disenchantment of the world, the elimination of magic as a means to salvation, the Catholics had not carried nearly so far as the Puritans had done. To the Catholics, the absolution of his church was a compensation for his own imperfection, right? So people just know that they're imperfect. And somehow the church has this magic uh, ability through the Eucharist and other things. I'm not quoting, I'm
Yep.
just sort of explaining that.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
the first part is all about the Catholic
Yeah.
situation, right? And what that experience was like. And then he says, here's the Calvinist. The Calvinist lives in this ascetic reality where God is just saying, you must be always improving, always getting better, always turning the world into something better. This is your calling. And this is one of his arguments in the book, is that basically with the Protestant Reformation, you see a move of something like a monastic calling, right? Like a monk is called to this ascetic, very like deliberative, prayerful, pious life. And that ends up getting disseminated, like spread out across for everybody. That's now the calling for all humans, not just monks. Which I'm just like, holy smokes! I'm having like PTSD. I'm like, reading it. It's just like, oh my goodness, that explains so much
Right.
uh, in
About
terms
your
of my own like
experience.
faith journey and
Yeah.
Christian walk.
Right.
But yeah, anyways,
One of the things I just kind of love about that, and I think will be kind of a significant part of our conversation, right, is as uh, a, a secular writer, right, like with pretty strong critiques of religion, but taking his understanding of religion and the people of whom he speaks is, I mean, obviously he was in a time where it had a much more significant social role, but and so maybe it was more important at that time. But it's really interesting to hear like a critic of religion who comes at it with a deeper understanding of it than many of what you might hear today. So that's
totally.
yeah, and so yeah, so us coming from different places, and but both of us with Christian backgrounds, I think that it's really important to be able to think about how to speak about religion, what it means in kind of in from a lot of different perspectives, both secular and religious, and of
Yeah.
course those two things encompassing a lot of worldviews, potentially even with overlap. And
Yeah, totally.
yeah, I don't know if it's worth highlighting just because so many people might not be familiar, right, with like Martin Luther,
Hmm.
who started the Protestant Reformation. Um, if there was one book that he was going to remove from the Bible, it was going to be the book of James, because the book of James talks about how he really wanted to emphasize this notion of salvation by faith, and that it wasn't of works, and to kind of get away from the way works had been used as potentially, I don't know, a cudgel on Catholic believers. And so in the book of James, it talks about how if you really believe, you will stop sinning, or at least be in the process of not of stopping your sin. So the notion of the Protestant work ethic, where Protestants have this emphasis on salvation by grace. It's not by anything that you do, but your faith is proved by your works.
Right.
So it ends up being this kind of like ironic twist where they tried to make this move of saying we're saved by grace alone, but it actually led them to this kind of need for relentless improvement that
Yes.
was the way by which they, yeah,
Yeah.
evidenced their faith.
Yeah. Oh,
Is
that's great. I mean, it's not great, but yes.
Well, it's ironic. It's tragic to me.
It's
So
tragic. Yeah.
it's tragic to me because like I've heard so many people criticize religion as this guilt-inducing thing. And for me, my experience of religion was never like that. It was so full of grace, and I still feel like my worldview is so oriented around the notion of grace. And so I don't relate to that. I really relate to this notion of Christianity being the place for screw ups, right? I mean,
Mm,
it's like and just being like when I screw up in life and have my guilt, it's just so great to have this
mm,
notion of grace
mm,
as an alternative to, and so comes to mind one of my favorite little pieces of I mean, I'm afraid of sounding now name droppy too, but Dostoevsky in Brothers Karamazov, there's
mm,
this this priest talks about, or a monk talks about an influential figure in his life who, as a boy, was very sick, and while he was sick, he had these terrible pangs of conscience, and was talking about himself as a sinner. And his family, everyone was saying to him, don't be so hard on yourself, but he kept saying, no, no, it's okay, because I know that I'm forgiven, and it's
mm,
better to be forgiven than to be perfect. Anyway,
mm.
this is a terrible aside that's pulling us far away
But
from
actually,
Weber's line.
it does pull us away, I guess, from Weber, but it's totally McCarraher's main. That's the thrust of a lot of what he's talking about when he talks about um, a sacramental ontology, which is a word set of words that need to be unpacked. But what he's talking about is he's saying this is a world that is abundant and good and full, and a world or be oriented towards the world sacramentally is to see it charged with God's grandeur. An ontology, and correct me if I'm wrong because this is how I've always thought of it,
Yeah,
but I don't actually know if that's true.
yeah,
But worldview, I think,
yeah,
is an okay other word for ontology.
yeah,
I'm sure that there's philosophers out there who would nitpick that, but
sure.
because otherwise, why wouldn't they just use the word worldview? It's way more clear.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
so a worldview that sees the world as um, full of goodness and
Hmm.
full of grace. A sacrament. So sacramental sacrament. Saint Augustine says that it is a material. Oh, a visible. Oh no, visible. object that is a sign of an invisible grace, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. I've butchered that quote, but
That's okay.
essentially it's something material that points beyond itself. So something like the Eucharist, right? The bread and wine that Christians take uh, at church, that
Mm-hmm.
is a sacrament because it's not just bread and wine. It's pointing beyond it to the sacrifice of Jesus, and certain versions of Christianity make that even more like magical and mystical, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But the idea of seeing the world sacramentally is to say there's grace right on the other side, and there's goodness all through it.
right.
And you can see, I think, the beginnings of thinking about something like scarcity, or like some of the terms that sometimes get associated with capitalist uh,
Mm,
economics,
yeah.
um, as being opposed to that kind of sacramental vision. If you see the world as abundant and full, but not in a way that's like, and it's full because I can just use as much of it as I want
Mm-hmm.
to increase my capital,
Mm-hmm.
um, then you're starting to get a sense of where the opposition is between sacramental ontology and at least what McCarraher is critiquing about capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I know we haven't even gotten into, but
No, that's okay.
we have
Yeah.
lots of notes on capitalism because it's like what does that even mean?
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know
Yeah. No, no. And I like it, right? Because like what we're doing here, right, is like, yeah, the capitalism can mean a lot of different things and socialism can mean a lot of different things. And so we're kind of acknowledging one, that we don't know what these things mean yet. And that there's probably there's not going to be perfect agreement on what they mean in the end either. And so that's why we're starting here, right? Is we're just trying to look at our understanding of one person's ideas and seeing where that takes us. So yeah, I'm I have these two sides of like I have a deep longing for an enchanted world, but also a fairly deep commitment to a kind of materialism. And so that as soon as the words capitalism do come up, I immediately have kind of like bifurcated views where I want to acknowledge this as like an important idea to keep thinking about and seeing what value is he pointing at that maybe we're missing and that he shows us a road to, McCarraher. But then also, this other side of me that's thinking, I I think you are, you're characterizing capitalism in a very sort of narrow way and potentially not showing us. You're highlighting a problem, but I'm not sure that you're showing us the road out. And um, but we'll get more into that as we go, I guess. Yeah, as this just being our long winding path to get to around a topic. Yeah.
yeah. So anyways, that's kind of like his perspective is we're still enchanted.
Mm-hmm.
We're still longing for things. We have these hopes and anxieties. And one of the things he's doing in his book is to show that, okay, um, the the end of the Catholic imagination, which is sort of this sacramental ontology, the end of that worldview, or the beginning of Protestantism, is this move towards improvement, and this move towards just God has
Mm-hmm.
asked you has called you to relentlessly improve the world, to basically pursue wealth for its own sake.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he calls this the Puritan covenantal theology,
Mm-hmm.
which is essentially, he's trying to say it's like with the Israelites, and how the Israelites had a covenant with God when they came into the promised land. The same thing was in the Puritans' way of thinking about themselves, right? That the Puritans would say, all right, we're coming to the new world. It's this land of plenty that God has basically commanded us to take from nature and cultivate, turn it into a civilization.
Mm.
And there's all these racial overtones as well with that.
Yeah.
And so what he says is this sort of drive, it's a continuance of the enchanted worldview, but it's sort of the objects of it have changed. So
Yeah.
that
It's
instead of,
enchanting.
yeah,
It's enchanting the material without seeing beyond it to something else.
yeah, the
So
material is like a means to the end of making money and amassing wealth.
right, right.
Um,
And so yeah, it's funny because in that critique, I both hear common uh kind of pitfalls that I may fall into in my thinking sometimes as maybe the more capitalist of the two of us. But I also feel like, and I'm not sure how much to foreshadow this, but I also feel like it's not seeing the way out, which is in some ways kind of built into the view of kind of a capitalist view where this utilitarian worldview that kind of is always seeing the world as only for the utility of wealth, where I think yeah, and I think it'll be good just in case we have our capitalists listening to know we do want to get to both sides of the story.
yeah,
And one of the ways that I'm interested in kind of talking about as a potential way out of this criticism is saying um, the the utility of wealth is is for the sake of something else, right? And
mm,
utilitarianism kind of says something for the sake of something else.
mm,
And we can, as humans, we may get lost in the pursuit of wealth, but that's our own mistake in failing to realize that any wealth, any everything is for the sake of the value that it can then contribute to, right? So just like, when you uh, when you have money, it is ultimately for the sake of something else, right?
yeah,
Feeding your family, uh, buying a gift for a loved one, right? And to give us the opportunity to kind of circumscribe a private life where what really matters to us can be our own or something
yes,
where we can pursue
yes,
that. But that's yeah. So but at the same time, I see very legitimate criticisms that he's making, right? And especially in terms of where you think about so much of our attention and focus can get to.
right,
And so I want to like fully explore this notion and of enchantment, right? Which is like which in many ways kind of maybe is touching on what this podcast might end up being hopefully more about in the long run, where as we explore socialism and capitalism, these are topics that have come up and have been interesting, but for us, I think are probably kind of a means to a discussion about what matters and
mm-hmm,
what we care about and things
mm-hmm,
like that. So I really feel like that's where he is. His insights are kind of coming from highlighting trying to repoint us at what matters and what we
mm-hmm.
should be thinking about. So
It's
um,
it's in some ways, I think, and this is not something that McCarraher says, but uh, one of the things that I've like the whole idea of there not being an outsider. What's the relation? Just to use something that we probably talked about in Philosophy 400 with Karen Hool, you and I,
yes,
however many years ago that was, 15 years ago.
yeah,
Um, the idea of the other, like
yeah,
what does it mean to be face to face with the other? And I think that the thing about McCarraher's critique, implicit critique of capitalism, and is that it applies to certain forms of capitalism, which, like you said, I think we're going to need to unpack.
hmm
Like what's the difference between corporate capitalism and, uh, you know, traditional capitalism,
hmm
or do the same things apply? And
hmm
at what point do relentlessly pursue wealth versus pursuing wealth in a kind of constrained way for a purpose outside of itself?
Hmm.
Like the Rockefellers don't come in for very good. Uh, they're not treated very well in this book.
Right, right.
um,
And I mean, and I don't know a lot about the Rockefellers, but I mean, yeah, yeah. So
I mean, John Rockefeller's the guy who famously said, you know, how much more money do you need? Well, just a little bit more.
right,
Um,
yes, yeah. Yeah, no, that yeah, that'll be good. So maybe just to kind of see, I'm not sure how this question's gonna go exactly because you said he doesn't talk about capitalism explicitly, but he seems to be suggesting that it is it's misenchanting the world, right? And so I guess I'm interested in like what is this more specifically? What is he pointing at? What's happening in this capitalist worldview, as he calls it, and how does it function in kind of like making us go wrong?
you know, one of the, I guess the thing that he does a lot, the first part of the book is sort of set in Europe and
Yeah,
covers a really long, like 1400 to I think 1800. I can't quite remember.
yeah,
And then the majority of the book is set in America. And he has sort of sections on the Puritans, and he has a section on sort of pre-Civil War, and then sort of Civil War to the end of the First World War. Um, and what he does a lot is he sort of has these little uh, stories about um, things that look like they're going to be different than just sort of capitulation to the worst tendencies of capitalism,
yeah,
right? Like even something like the Puritan sort of, we're just going to work hard and you know do what God wants us to do and that kind of thing. You know that could end up looking like it's going to get worse and worse. But then he says, but then they have this like desire for community, right? They're looking for this community, this their way of thinking about themselves, but it almost always goes bad because capitalism. That's essentially
yeah,
his,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
it's sort of a story that he repeats again and again from different perspectives. Where he's like, you know, he'll talk about Frederick Taylor, for example, who is the founder of scientific management. You know, and he was
oh,
a mechanical engineer who. You some people have heard him. Taylorism is basically like where you go in and you systemically record how long does it take to do a particular task, and
mm-hmm,
then you try to find ways to make it more and more efficient.
mm-hmm,
um, you know, and it's still extremely common. It's a
mm-hmm,
pretty standard way of doing things. And what he says is he's like, you know, there's something about Taylorism that is has kind of, and this is where he critiques management theory in general, is,
yeah,
you know, it's manipulative. It treats people as sort of means to the greater end of, you know, increasing profits.
yeah,
um, you know, all of those sorts of critiques. But he says, but the thing that's weird is that for Frederick Taylor, he thought this is going to unify employers and employees. This is going to create this, you know, uh, benevolent community where everyone's just working towards the greater good of like being effective at our work and not making our work like lame, you know, minimizing the sort of the tedious kinds of things and trying to find ways of doing work better. And it's funny because, you know, both of us do different kinds of management work,
yeah,
and there's, I think, that kind of like positive tone is something that sticks around, right?
yeah,
McCarraher doesn't like that positive tone
yeah,
because for him, he says this is really just uh, sort of it's like the best tendencies of humans, like that desire for community, that desire for you know, just all being on the same team and making life better, right? Increasing our freedom.
mm-hmm,
They're all good things, but they end up getting put towards bad things like
mm-hmm,
just making a small number of people richer,
yeah,
you know, and like, yeah, anyways, you could go on and on about the different
mm-hmm.
problems with capitalism from his perspective, but
Yeah. Well, we may, right? Like, I mean, I do think I think the particulars matter, right? And so
absolutely.
because for me, I'm just often concerned about how the word capitalism gets thrown about. And so I like hearing the specific critiques because a specific critique can be bang on and say, yeah, that thing you're talking about is bad. Do we not have to use the word capitalism to describe that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I mean, and my suspicion is, and that uh, some of the things that socialists call capitalism and vice versa, they would not self-describe that way. So
Mm.
and it is interesting too. So I would be interested, and maybe we will end up doing this, whether we record it for others or not. But in kind of a deeper conversation about this management theory stuff, because I again feel like there are. It's hard sometimes to tell the difference between a good idea that's hard to execute well and a bad idea.
Yeah.
And so I just can't help but feel like there are actually, like, there's good things in it to be optimistic about, and that it is often misused by people with power. And also I can see some limitations that it almost always faces. But yeah,
Yeah. And when you like, I think I agree. I think it'd be interesting to look into it, because I think sometimes when you start from the textbook,
yeah,
and this is the theory, and it's implicitly top down because you're starting from the textbook.
yeah,
It's very different than when you are doing, sort of trying to improve work, uh, the nature of work, or
hmm,
of different kinds of activities that you do during your work.
yeah,
That ground level interaction with people, and trying to
hmm,
find ways to make work better,
hmm,
and more effective, I guess, is always part of that. But
yeah,
I agree. Like, and I think the problem sometimes with the way that it gets critiqued is that we're critiquing the textbook,
yeah.
which isn't necessarily a
How it's always applied.
perfect. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
no, yeah, keep going.
I was just going to say, we should look at Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, because he
Hmm.
has, I think, at least one chapter that's about management theory.
Yeah.
And Alistair McIntyre, although he, I think, probably falls on the left, or he at least used to be a Marxist
Hmm.
before he became a Catholic. Um,
Hmm.
the thing about him is that he's often used by more conservatives,
Mm.
in some of the ways of thinking. He's big on tradition,
Right.
or positive about it.
Yeah.
So he might be someone that we could look into.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, and I would even go so far as to, yeah, I'll I'll put in another little kind of like plug for capitalism. So a lot of the time, the challenges that people run into in capitalism are what are described in textbooks on capitalism as externalities,
Right.
right? And this is where um, in any exchange, there can be outside effects that aren't effects on the seller or the buyer. And so these can be positive or negative, right? And the most famous example currently being is the carbon footprint of the exchange.
Right.
And so um, when there's this carbon footprint which doesn't uniquely impact the buyer or the seller, rather it's releasing carbon and warming the atmosphere of the whole planet, this is an externality to the exchange. And this is not something capitalists are unaware of, right? At the very kind of like beginning of capitalism, in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, not that I've read it, again, I just have this like vague understanding of what he's written about.
Perfect.
um, he talks about externalities and recognizes them right up front and acknowledges them as an important place for state intervention. And so the interesting thing is, like, we have a current cultural climate in which many conservatives who might self-describe as capitalists oppose a climate tax or a carbon tax. But in many ways, the importance of a carbon tax is acknowledged like right up front from a capitalist,
Right.
from the father of capitalism,
Right.
if we're okay with giving
Yeah.
him that name. So um,
I mean,
yeah,
that's a question I would love for us to explore, is how do we get from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman?
right. Well, I mean, yeah.
How does that happen?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, and I would be also interested in discussing Milton Friedman more thoroughly because, I think there's wisdom from Milton Friedman, right? Like, one of the big things that we see the left pushing for is more money in higher education. And what that ends up being most of the time it's a very regressive form of taxation where we're
Mm,
taxing everybody and then we're giving all that money back to the rich people who go to university.
right.
And and so Milton Friedman would suggest that that's just a great example of how stupid all of our interventions are and
Mm,
how they end up accomplishing the opposite of what we want
mm,
most of the time.
mm.
And so um, I don't again, I don't know a lot about Milton Friedman. I've seen a few YouTube videos, and I can understand why people get like very irritated at that smile on his face that never goes away as he.
It's fun to like just sort of use people though as like placeholders for
Yeah.
you
Oh,
know
agreed. No, and we'll do
which
that all the
but
time, right?
it's
Yeah.
I think that hopefully part of what we can do is when we're saying something like well Adam Smith,
Mm-hmm.
suddenly by digging just a little bit deeper we can say, oh yeah, the shorthand that I want to mean when I say Adam Smith is
Yeah.
not as uh, easy to kind of hold on to. You know,
Yeah.
maybe I mean the
It's
late Adam Smith, or maybe I don't mean Adam Smith at all. Maybe I mean
right.
Milton Friedman.
Yeah,
you
or
know,
and maybe I mean my brother-in-law's understanding of Adam Smith, right?
right, right.
But and maybe what we can do, because I agree, like placeholders are useful, right? We're not going to be able, so we can always or maybe not always, but occasionally we can be clear that we're with Milton Friedman or the idea of Milton Friedman as a placeholder for, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and Milton Friedman, I think, comes out of a tradition of uh, Hayek,
Oh,
who
okay. Yeah.
right. So the two kind of potentially the two biggest streams of economists come from Hayek, who's the slightly less famous, and then the most famous being the Brit.
Uh,
Oh my goodness. Anyway,
Keynes.
Keynes. That's it.
Okay.
Exactly.
Do you know
Perfect.
that John Maynard Keynes, I don't know if it's his grandson or something like that, played Edmund in the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe movie?
Oh my goodness, that I love this. This
Isn't that
is my
interesting? I
favorite.
think it
Yeah.
maybe a great nephew or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Anyways,
that's yeah, so those two, right? And I guess one of the virtues that I'm eventually going to want to get to when we talk more about capitalism. And so now I'm okay with us having signposted here because um uh, I do actually have a friend of mine who is very much a capitalist. Like he will go very far, and he, of course, that's what does that mean, right? It's a
right.
particular kind. But if he was listening to this, and to McCarraher, he would just be, he's going to be losing it. He would not. He would just be wanting to jump in on every point. Um, and so for him, I kind of feel like it's. I do want to signpost that we want to discuss these things on both sides. And one of the things that I think the non-capitalists, um, there's an element of humility in what we can know and what we can do that is kind of a really important part of what I think underpins capitalism and trying to limit the kind of the scope of our intervention because we're not
Mm,
as smart as we think we are.
right.
And that kind of humility, I think, can really be drawn out as a significant virtue. But yeah, it's we'll see as we keep talking about it more.
For sure. And I think, one of the things that it brings up to me is, there's overlaps in definitions between things like libertarian and
Hmm.
capitalist.
Hmm.
And I often think that maybe when we're talking about capitalist, we're actually meaning libertarian
Right.
because, certain forms of capitalism have tons of intervention.
Hmm.
And it's not contradictory to a certain version of capitalism. If
Hmm.
capitalism is the means of production, right,
Hmm.
are in the hands of the capitalist, which is just one part of a
Yeah.
definition that's probably not even accurate. But
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether there's intervention or no non-intervention. And
Yes.
so something about McCarraher that's interesting is that when I go through over and over again, he's quite critical of socialists
Yeah. Right. Right.
because and I mean I think he would define himself as a socialist,
Yep.
but he's the thing is he actually has a lot of good stuff to say about anarchism
Yeah.
as well, and anarchism has a lot to do with non-intervention.
Right. That's right.
Libertarians and anarchists have a certain amount of overlap as well.
Yeah. I don't know how many pure uh like these ideas of capitalism and how many different versions there are and what the core kind of tenets are. And so for sure, like I mostly when I uh, when I defend it, it's based on my very vague understanding of Adam Smith, who also wrote other works of philosophy that are like quite charitable and quite human,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And I don't think he was
He's the father of modern sympathy, right? Like
of our notion of
of our
sympathy.
notion of sympathy. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. So
and yeah, and so that's where, and he's of course coming out of a very specific context of like where we've got major world powers that are manipulating economies that and for their own kind of power, the economic power as a occasional alternative to military intervention, right?
right.
And kind of using it as a form of warfare. And so he was saying to the state, you need to stop doing this, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, so the details of what all of that is we'll want to get to later. And also with McCarraher and yeah, let's maybe move back to that for a while. I guess we've gone on a pretty like wide rabbit trail, but that I think does an okay job of kind of signposting some of where we're going to go
Yeah.
and just kind of see what else he might have to say. So um,
I think where I'm at in the book, I'm actually really excited about what's next, what's coming up in it. I know that he has a discussion of Disney, which is going to be awesome, and he has a discussion of a more in-depth discussion of advertising and sort of the role it plays in developing what he calls a corporate soul. How do we get society to start thinking of capitalism as, or thinking of um, these industries as being more than just profit creating industries? How do we make them begin to get a personality, and sort of start creating identities where we can
mm,
belong to that personality,
mm.
right? Where I can be a Coke
As
or
like is that
Pepsi.
specifically and like examples of like the enchantment of them?
Yeah, like I mean, I think I'm this is what I would love to see in it. I have a
Yeah,
feeling that he'll be at a
yeah,
higher level than that,
sure. No, no, yeah.
and and talking about sort of the emergence of advertising as a brand development, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm really looking forward to it. I think the thing that I've been loving about this book is just that it presents the possibility that there might be another world, but that it's not a utopia that needs to be built from scratch. It's actually something that's already there. That it has this optimism about God and the universe and who we are as creatures within it. Um, that is, I mean, I think sometimes he comes down too hard on the capitalists, right? These partly because it's often what'll happen is someone will be doing something really great. He talks about John Muir, who's the founder of the Sierra Club, I think,
Oh
like
yeah.
an environmentalist movement, right?
Hmm.
And they're doing this great stuff, but then they're friends with all these people who are not that great and stuff like
Yeah,
that, right? And he doesn't
yeah,
really like that very much.
yeah.
Um, so I mean, for me, it's the thing about this book, I think that I am loving is that it has this other imagination, and it's also not simplistic. If it's come across simplistic, then
Mm,
that's my fault for sure.
yeah.
Because I think one of the things that he's really all about is um, breaking down the many different alternatives that there are, both for capitalism and for socialism. He says he's tracing the development of all these different alternative capitalisms, and that's not what he wants, right? He doesn't want an alternative capitalism. He wants an alternative to capitalism.
Hmm.
And so the thread of a lot of the stories that he tells is this thread of, oh, maybe this is going to be something different or something new, and then, oh no, it's not actually.
Yeah.
But the thing is I think it does present something interesting about the possibility for difference and diversity. Um, and one of the things he does that's also quite interesting is this alternative communism to Marx's communism.
Mm-hmm.
He really critiques Marx very harshly
Hmm.
in terms of his technocratism, with its sort of emphasis on regimentation, industrialism. He says, what does he say? He says, Marx and Engels endorse industrial despotism. And he draws attention to Lenin's embrace of Taylorism, of Frederick Taylor's
Mm-hmm.
systems, which he says confirmed that the authoritarian features of Soviet industry were modeled after the most imperious brand of American corporate discipline.
Right.
This is his thing, right? Like
Yeah.
I love the adjectives he uses.
Yeah.
but
No, he is a good writer.
but so for him, Marx is a great diagnostician, but not a great the prescription that he's written us is not great.
Right.
And so that's why he's going back to people that just aren't really on our radar anymore, like John
Yeah.
Ruskin and William Morris
Yeah.
and Lewis Mumford and E.F. Schumacher, Vida Dutton Scudder, just names that I mean, I've heard of some of these names, but a lot of them
Yeah.
I've never heard of before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's got all of these lists of books that they wrote, and they're almost all available on the Internet Archive. So
Right.
it's cool. Like that's what
Yeah.
I've been loving about it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know exactly how popular Zizek is these days, but I mean, I do see. I mean, it's. I feel like he's probably coming from a fairly different perspective on these issues, but they have a lot in common. So Zizek also talks about Marx as a um, mm, his assessment as being good, but his prescriptions as maybe not as ideal, and his expectations as misplaced on what communism will deliver. And he also is very opposed to bosses and employees getting along. He thinks, he's
right.
they
Yeah,
should be giving
yeah,
each other the finger at a regular basis,
yeah,
especially because of the significant power imbalance.
yes,
Um, which of course, yeah, is all of which may come up again as we discuss more about capitalism. um yeah, that's interesting. And the ideas of the corporate soul in advertising, I think I'm looking forward to you finishing that too and us coming back to discuss it further. And it's quite interesting because I feel like many of his concerns are going to actually parallel the concerns of the capitalists I'm most familiar with. And
totally.
yeah, and if I had to fault him, if I had to pick, it would be the fact that in the same way we discussed using somebody's name as a placeholder, that he uses capitalism as a placeholder for these terrible things when the word in a way that's not helpful when talking to a capitalist about how to structure an economy.
Right.
But yeah, it'll be interesting to return to him as we kind of discuss these. And I just have this imagining future where I think, oh yeah, he is a capitalist,
Oh,
with
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
um,
I
by whatever kind
well,
of
I guess he's
definition
not
of.
coming on the show now.
Well, but I mean, yeah, and I might be overly optimistic here, but I have this strong hope for the ability to abandon our current understandings of words and trying to find um, simpler, less like words that we haven't all come to positions on in advance, where there are actually many kind of points of agreement on these underlying I
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
I
ways
mean,
of talking about something.
and I think this will probably come up in the next episode more, but when what I've been trying to keep track of the things that he's critiquing when he associate like the things that he associates with capitalism and critiques, like the pursuit of profit, property, unregulated free trade, the right to sell for most and buy for least, the principle of combination, the glorification of work for its own sake,
Mm,
the attempt to maximize production and minimize labor, the unquestioned good of large-scale routinized production, material abundance as the precondition of justice and emancipation, mechanization. Anyways, I have a long
Those
list.
are awesome. No, that's so good.
And what would be interesting to me is if we could look at some of those and say, so is this implicitly connected to capitalism? I think a lot of them aren't implicitly connected because,
Mm-hmm.
like he would say, they show up in Russia, right? They show up in certain forms of quote unquote communism,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe that's the place where that's actually not the right term. Is that we
Right.
shouldn't be using that to describe what's happening in Russia? I don't know.
Yes. I mean, and maybe just as like one more example of like a concern that is like very clear in early capitalist writing is the notion of government capture
Mm,
by money and I guess what we would now call big business.
mm,
And so this is, I think, often something that socialists are very concerned about, but capitalists are in many, or again, from a particular capitalist perspective,
yeah,
this is the problem they're almost most concerned about, and they see how governments are corrupted by money,
yeah,
and where their opponents say, let's make government bigger, they say no, government corruption is an inherent problem, and that we manage by minimizing the role of
right,
government and preventing them as being this tool that
right.
corporate interests can use. So that's, yeah, those the
Interesting.
yeah, so the list you have there, I'm excited. I look for it. We can review it and then come back to some of those topics.
Well,
Yeah.
I wonder a little bit too whether the two-sided coin of neoliberalism and neoconservatism,
Mm.
right? That these two terms that get bandied about, which I admit that I don't really understand that well, but I
Hmm.
know that they're both bad or something.
Yes,
That's what I've
yes.
been told.
Yeah,
But that they're really kind of two sides of the same coin.
right.
And the two ways that a more conservative, quote unquote, capitalist way of doing things um, that emphasizes government is just can be seen in the same context with a liberal kind of place where you have government also playing a major role.
Hmm.
Um, so, I mean, I think, and maybe this gets us to the point of where we start talking about what we want to talk about next.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. So I think we've kind of said we'll try to kind of dive in a little deeper onto our understanding of what capitalism is,
Yes.
um, and other thoughts, like just kind of as where you see us, as what are the biggest pockets of ignorance we've highlighted that we might want to move towards
Yes.
further circumscribing.
So many.
So
So
many.
many.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a topic that I would love to talk more about is when I think about the possibility of the outside. I
Yeah.
always frame it in that kind of way, which is maybe sort of pretentious sounding, but it's like, is there an outside to the world
Yeah.
that we know of? And it doesn't have to be God,
Yeah.
but like, what does an outside look like?
What does that mean?
Yeah. And I mean,
Well,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
and just how much of the word God is like the word capitalism, where like we're so quick to make assumptions about what that means and whether or not that
Yeah.
might be possible. But even just like the outside is, I think, a legitimate way of, I mean, it's we could often use that in place of the word God, right? Just this
Mm,
notion of um, something that is not contained.
mm-hmm.
I mean, and for me, first and foremost, at least by our understanding, right? Let alone,
Yeah.
maybe all the world that is.
It's Karl Barth's notion of God as the holy other, right? The holy other, which means that it's not something that can be just captured. I mean, the thing about the Calvinist God that Weber hates,
Yeah.
or at least speaks harshly about, is
Yes.
that it's a God who doesn't understand us, but has extremely high expectations of us. And so in some ways is a very small God. Like it's
Right.
like, whereas I love the idea of just the outside, like the mystery, right? What is the
Mm.
mystery, the unknowing
Hmm.
um, of 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 existence?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that
And
there is a gap between certain, like, maybe certain religious traditions
yeah.
version of that, even though
Yeah.
there's a mystical element there,
Yeah.
and maybe other, like a secular version of that.
Yeah.
But Yeah, sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's good. I mean, and with the, I think just kind of acknowledging that religious language and religious topics are going to be pretty important to a lot of the way that we talk about things. And so, like, because I'm not sure how strongly to draw the distinction between the outside, right? But also even this notion of the sublime nature of the inside, right? Even
Yeah.
right, and those are like two very related ideas. But like, so maybe it's more imminent than anything outside. Maybe
Mm,
it's in the here and now. But even so, just the notion of oh no, and now this is the second time this story has come to my mind recently that I do not know how to tell, but it's a story about um, a wealthy prince who witnesses a wise old man who turns down wealth or even throws it away, and the prince is maddened by this thought of this man, and eventually throws his wealth into the ocean and goes out in search of this man to find out what he has that makes him able to live with no consideration for the powers of men, and he eventually finds this man, and he says, "What do you have that enables you to do this?" And this old man, knowing that the prince has thrown away his wealth to come and meet him, says, I have what you now have too, right? This notion of seeking for that thing
mm,
that is more than just the material or
hmm
something of the
hmm
or in the material but matters
Yeah.
somehow, the sources of meaning.
Yeah.
And I I hope that lots of what we touch on going forward is kind of revolves around some of that. So
Yeah. Me too. I think it will.
that's great. Anything else that we need to do before closing off?
I don't know. I feel I need to read 300 pages.
Yep, good.
You've got The Wealth of Nations,
Yes.
books
Well,
1 to 5. I don't know how many books are you reading. No, I'm just joking.
yeah, well, I mean, yeah, either The Wealth of Nations or at least the Wikipedia article about it. But
Absolutely,
yes, yeah,
100%.
yeah.
I might, you know what? I'll put in the show notes. I don't know what those are or how we make them, but
Hmm.
the
Great. Yeah,
original article to the Quarterly, the
awesome.
Plow Quarterly article, because I think it's open to anybody. So,
Yep, that sounds great.
but
Well, this has been really great for me.
me too.
Thanks so much for doing this with me, and
Likewise.
I look forward to doing more of this.
Me too. Okay.
Hey,
Thanks, everybody.
yeah, thanks. Okay, bye.
See ya.